Evening, collectors, archivists, and those of you who've ever wondered who first wrote down the nightmares you were told as children. This is Silas, the Deranged, Garaynj, broadcasting from somewhere between the library and the folk memory. And tonight, we're not telling a fairy tale. We're telling the story of the men who collected them. The brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm, two German scholars who, in 1812, published a book that would shape childhood terror for the next 2 centuries. They didn't mean to. That's the best part. They absolutely did not mean to. But who were they, and what were they really doing? Jacob Grimm was born in 1785. Wilhelm followed a year later. They grew up in Hanau, Germany, the eldest surviving sons of a family that would eventually number 9 children. Their father was a lawyer, respectable, comfortable. Then he died when Jacob was 11, and everything changed, because of course it did. The family fell into poverty. The boys were sent to live with an aunt in Kassel, where they could attend a prestigious school. They were poor students among wealthy ones, outsiders. They had each other, and they had books, and they had the growing conviction that something was being lost. 2 orphan-adjacent brothers, alone against the world, convinced they're the only ones who can save someone precious. I'm not saying they were living in a fairy tale. I'm saying the fairy tale was already living in them. Germany in the early 1800s wasn't Germany. Not yet. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, fragments of the old Holy Roman Empire, soon to be trampled by Napoleon's armies. There was no unified German nation, no shared German identity, just regions, dialects, local traditions slowly dying as the modern world encroached. Think of it as a fairy tale kingdom that hadn't figured out it was a kingdom yet. 100 little fiefdoms, each with their own version of why you shouldn't go into the woods at night. The brothers Grimm were linguists, scholars. They studied law, then abandoned it for philology, the study of language and its history. They believed that buried in the German language, in its oldest forms, in its folk tales and songs and sayings, was the soul of a people. A people who didn't yet know they were a people. They weren't trying to entertain children. They were trying to preserve a culture before it vanished. Noble goal, absolutely backfired in the best possible way. The fairy tales came from everywhere and nowhere. The brothers collected them from friends, from servants, from the educated women of Kassel who remembered stories their nurses had told them. They collected from a retired soldier, from a tailor's wife, from anyone who remembered the old tales. Picture it. 2 very serious young men with notebooks lurking near grandmothers at social gatherings. Excuse me, ma'am, could you repeat the part about the cannibalism? I need to get the phrasing right. One of their most important sources was Dorothea Vieman, a tailor's widow who knew dozens of stories. She was 60 years old when they met her, descended from French Huguenots with a memory like a library that never closed. She told them Cinderella, the robber bridegroom, the devil with the 3 golden hairs. Story after story, precise and detailed, as if she were reading from a book that existed only in her mind. Dorothea Vieman, remember that name. 200 years later, children are afraid of the dark, because this woman had a very good memory and a willingness to share. The brothers wrote down what they heard, then they rewrote it, then they rewrote it again. Scholars can't leave well enough alone. It's a disease. This is important. The Grimm fairy tales are not transcriptions. They're not recordings. They're literary constructions built from folk materials. The brothers edited, combined, adjusted. They made the language more formal. They added Christian morality where pagan fate had been. They softened some horrors. So if you've ever read a Grimm fairy tale and thought, this feels like it was written by a committee of 1 German aunt and 2 nervous academics, congratulations. You have an excellent ear. In the first edition of 1812, the evil queen in Snow White is the girl's biological mother. By later editions, she's become a stepmother. Apparently, maternal murder was too disturbing, even for Germans who'd grown up on these tales. Stepmothers, the Grimm's preferred villain upgrade. This story about a mother trying to murder her daughter is a bit much, Wilhelm. What if she's a stepmother? Problem solved. Print it. The brothers published 7 editions of their collection over 40 years, each one slightly different from the last, polished, refined, made more suitable for the children who, to their surprise, became the primary audience. 7 editions, 40 years. These men revised fairy tales the way some people refinish furniture. They hadn't meant to write a children's book. They'd meant to write a scholarly monument to German folklore. But parents started reading these tales to their children, and the tales stuck. They stuck because they were true. Not factually true, but emotionally true. True to what children already suspected about the world. That parents could fail you. That the forest was dangerous. That strangers might be wolves. That cleverness could save you when strength couldn't. That the dead sometimes spoke. That promises had teeth. Literally, in some versions, the promises had actual teeth. These weren't fantasies. They were warnings encoded in metaphor, passed down by generations of peasants who knew exactly how dark the world could get. The brothers didn't invent the darkness. They just wrote it down before it could be forgotten. First rule of horror: the scariest stories aren't the ones someone made up. They're the ones someone remembered. Jacob never married. Wilhelm did, a woman named Dorchen Wild, who had herself contributed stories to the collection. They all lived together, the two brothers and Wilhelm's family, for their entire lives. They worked side by side at the same library, the same university, the same endless projects. Wilhelm married one of his sources. Think about that. He married a woman in part because she knew excellent fairy tales. There are worse foundations for a marriage. I've seen a few, because the fairy tales were only part of their work. Jacob and Wilhelm also compiled the first comprehensive German dictionary. They started it in 1838. They died before finishing it. The dictionary wasn't completed until 1961, over a century after they began. 123 years. To finish a dictionary. Let's just define all the words, Jacob. How hard could it be? Very hard, apparently. Fatally hard. They died mid-alphabet. Jacob got as far as the word fruit. Fruit. Wilhelm didn't even make it. They spent their final years arguing about German compound nouns, which, if you've ever seen a German compound noun, is an argument that could legitimately take decades. They were also political, in their quiet, scholarly way. In 1837, they were among 7 professors who publicly protested when the new King of Hanover abolished the Constitution. They lost their jobs. They were exiled for defending a constitution. 2 men who collected fairy tales about the powerless, outsmarting tyrants. And when the time came, they acted like the heroes in their own stories. The king expected them to bow. They expected the king to read. Different expectations. The king had an army. The brothers had stories. I'll let you guess which one people still remember, but they'd made their point. Some things matter more than comfort. Some truths need speaking even when they cost you everything. Wilhelm died in 1859. Jacob followed in 1863. They're buried together in Berlin, as they would have wanted. 2 brothers who spent their lives side by side, preserving stories that would outlive them by centuries. Side by side, even in the ground. If that's not the ending of a fairy tale, I don't know what is. So what do we make of the Brothers Grimm? They were products of their time, romantic nationalists who believed in the mystical connection between language, folklore, and national identity. Some of their ideas have aged poorly. The notion of a pure Germanic folk culture, uncorrupted by foreign influence, would later be twisted by people with much darker agendas than Jacob and Wilhelm ever imagined. The brothers collected fairy tales. Other people later collected the brothers' ideas and used them for things that were not fairy tales at all. That's the problem with putting powerful things on paper. You don't get to choose who picks them up after you set them down. But the tales themselves transcend their collectors. The stories existed before the Grimms wrote them down, and they'll exist long after we've forgotten who collected them. Because the stories aren't really about Germany. They're about being human, about the fears we all share, about the truths we tell children, because we can't bring ourselves to say them plainly. Don't trust strangers. Don't break promises. Don't assume your family will protect you. Be clever. Be patient. Be brave. And if someone hands you keys to every room but one, be very, very careful, especially that last one. Nothing good has ever come from a forbidden door, not once, in the entire history of forbidden doors, and yet people keep opening them. The Brothers Grimm didn't invent these lessons. They inherited them from centuries of nurses and grandmothers and servants who whispered these tales in the dark to children who needed to hear them. The brothers were scribes, not authors, collectors, not creators. They caught something wild and wrote it down before it could escape. And now, 200 years later, we're still reading their book, still telling their tales, still frightening children with the same old wolves and witches and forbidden doors. Because children still need to learn, and fairy tales still know how to teach. Speaking of preservation, and because even archivists need sponsors, a word from our benefactors. Tired of your family's oral traditions fading into silence? Worried that future generations won't know the proper way to outwit wolves or escape wicked stepmothers? Introducing the Folklore Preservation Society. We specialize in the collection, archival, and careful mounting of cultural heritage before it wanders off into the modern world and gets itself lost. Our services include the Story Salon, a comfortable fireside setting designed to encourage elderly relatives to share tales they haven't told in decades. We provide the schnapps. We provide the sympathetic listener. We provide the notebook disguised as a knitting pattern, where the grandmother begins. Once upon a time, our trained archivists spring gently into action. You'll have her narrative preserved before she remembers she was supposed to be making dinner. The Scholarly Companion, a transcription specialist who nods at appropriate moments, says, fascinating repeatedly, takes meticulous notes while maintaining the appearance of casual interest. Very convincing. We modeled them after the Grimm brothers themselves, minus the dictionary obsession, mostly. The editorial refinement package. 7 progressively gentler versions of whatever tale you've collected. Watch biological mothers become stepmothers. See gruesome punishments soften into consequences. By the 7th edition, your story will be suitable for the children who were never supposed to be the primary audience anyway. And our premium offering, the archival treatment, applied directly to folk tales to prevent them from aging out of relevance. Your stories will remain vivid for centuries, long after the firesides where they were first told have gone cold. The Folklore Preservation Society, because oral traditions don't have to stay oral. Please note, preserved tales may develop unexpected undertones when left in storage for extended periods. We are not responsible for future reinterpretation of collected materials. Some grandmothers may be reluctant to share. Do not attempt to archive tales that are still being actively told. They have a way of changing on you mid-sentence. The Folklore Preservation Society. Catch them before their grim side effects include academic careers, dictionary obsessions, political exile, and the persistent feeling that children today don't know how lucky they are to have been warned. And that brings us, with all tales properly archived, to the end of tonight's broadcast. In the weeks to come, we'll be exploring the Grimm collection, story by story, the darkness they preserved, the warnings they encoded, the truth they couldn't say any other way. Next week, Hansel and Gretel, a story about parents who abandon their children, children who eat a house, and what happens when you push a witch into an oven. Spoiler, it smells terrible and solves the problem. Until then, dear listeners, remember that someone had to write these stories down, or they'd have been lost. Someone had to catch the nightmares before they faded. Someone had to believe that old wives' tales were worth preserving. The brothers Grimm believed, and because they did, you know what a wolf sounds like when it lies. This has been Silas, the Deranged, Garaynj, reminding you that fairy tales were never meant to tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed. You're listening because someone once told you a story that was too dark for children, and you never forgot it.